Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to try to convey some ideas here without a PowerPoint presentation. It's really nice to follow Alex's presentation there. I think we have very complementary pieces here. He discussed this idea of finding feasible options for countries that are looking for a low carbon development pathway, and shared some of the country-specific targets that are emerging around how to reduce emissions and maintain a development trajectory at the same time. I work on the kind of the flip side of that coin. I work on climate resilient development policies, and we're also in the business of looking for things that are feasible. As we come up on COP21, I think we're seeing what looks to be likely, regardless of the COP outcome, to be a number of different forces that are going to accelerate national planning for climate change, including both adaptation and mitigation. And so getting ready for that requires thinking on both sides. I think we've seen this year an elevation of the adaptation and resilience side of the coin, and it's become much more prominent in many places than it's been before. So there's some catching up to be done on the side of this challenge that I work on. I thought I would start by framing out some of the issues and the concerns we look at when we're thinking about planning at the national level for climate resilience. And really the starting point is the nature of the changes we're seeing. There is tremendous uncertainty as you get to a smaller scale, and Alex described this in his presentation. Much of what we can learn from the models doesn't always get granular enough for the kinds of planning that national policymakers like to do. And essentially, given the limitations of the projections and the science and the nature of what kinds of changes we're seeing, one of the hallmarks of climate change is a growth in uncertainty about the weather. We just have trouble knowing what it's going to do. Predictions and projection capacities are improving, but whether that helps you decide how high to build a wall, exactly which variety to plant, what opportunities you have to make a hedge against certain risks in a certain agricultural season. This is still a question mark in many parts of the world, especially in places where data is scarce or below quality. The other thing we really see that's very linked to this uncertainty is volatility. And so countries are planning for real big changes in their weather, in their seasonality, in the rainfall patterns. This kind of change is a little trickier in many cases than planning for a particular increase in temperature or a particular decrease in moisture. Planning for more rain when you have rain and less rain when you don't have rain, and this year the rainy season starts earlier than it's ever started. Next year the rainy season starts later than it's ever started. This context in terms of what we're facing with climate change is a part of what we're hoping to help countries build into their planning and their policy making. The other thing to know about climate change is that in terms of food security, as one important example, it's really only one factor. And this came out very clearly in the first presentation we saw from Keith, where you can't just look at the projections for climate. You have to look at other important socioeconomic factors at a large scale. And then at a small scale, you really have to look at a whole range of different factors that affect how a particular community or household or country experiences a particular global change in the climate. As we globalize, there's more and more of these factors that are in play. And one of my colleagues did an analysis of the 2008 food price spikes as just an example of how, at a global level, you have multiple factors that play in as causes to a particular food security outcome in a particular place. And these factors, they sort of cascade from global level to local level and intersect with very location-specific factors. So So in the 2008 cases, some of the factors at play, I think this audience is quite familiar with. We had an increase in oil prices at the same time as there was very high demand. We had an increase in the cost of agricultural inputs, and one of the things that occurred as a result was an incentive to increase biofuels farming. So we also had low grain stocks globally, and we had, in some analyses, speculative trading on this low availability commodity. Then you had adverse weather, and that adverse weather was in pretty far-flung places. The start of the drought in the US, the fires in Russia, effects in Australia. These play out across global markets and lead to food insecurity in places that are very, very far away, but which are mediated not only by this complex causality context, but also by very local and very personal vulnerability factors. An individual's livelihood in a developing country makes that person more or less climate sensitive than many of their neighbors. So fishermen and farmers, they're very directly dependent on very climate sensitive resources. People who gather products in forests, these livelihoods are inherently more linked with the climate than many livelihoods. Likewise, you see really important socioeconomic considerations in vulnerability, age and gender, and other aspects of socioeconomic status, ethnicity, marginalization, one way or another. These factors affect people's access to resources. They affect their ability to voice their concerns and be felt in a political sense, to drive some of the collective choices that make a difference for food security in the end. And these very location-specific factors, including, by the way, environmental degradation, which is quite important for many of these climate-sensitive resources, these all interplay with some of these global forces at work to add up to outcomes around food security or food insecurity. So looking at this complexity and imagining baking that into national policy sometimes looks really daunting. We're many of us from a very reductionist analytic background, and we like to see the cause and the effect as the foundation for finding solutions for things. Really thinking about climate resilience often means kind of moving away from that very standard problem-solving model that we're all often very comfortable with, and recognizing that, well, we have this complexity of causes. It's getting increasingly volatile. What can we do in this context? Well, you look at these different causes and you say, what do I really care about here? Do I care about the causes, or do I care about the outcomes? And the outcomes in terms of livelihood sustainability and loss of livelihoods, these are the things we really worry about, and we need to bake into adaptation planning as it moves to the fore. So again, coming in part from this analysis of the 2008 food price spikes, we've looked at sort of three policy opportunities that we think are quite robust to this volatility and to the complexity associated with climate change impacts. The first one, it's not the most satisfying, but in the long run, I think this is where the real win is. We need to be helping developing countries in particular to build out observation systems, vulnerability observation systems, to know where the vulnerability is. So when that unpredictable, volatile climate change impact plays out, where is it most likely to play out? And this means looking at a number of socioeconomic factors. It means looking at environmental factors and the kinds of environmental degradation that really mediate climate change impacts. It means looking at things that often are difficult to monitor in terms of conflict or in terms of movements of people and the likely flows of people when there is an impetus for movement. The second thing that's a natural here, and I think we've seen some good progress on this in parts of the world, is the development of safety nets. And having a safety net that's really focused on the outcome of loss of livelihood, of lack of access to food. How can different countries structure those safety nets in ways that work, given the range of potential impacts that could lead to the outcomes they worry about? And then the third one is a set of solutions that I think is still in its infancy, actually, but some people call it risk governance. The idea that decision-making systems themselves need to be functioning differently, need to be responding to those observation systems, need to be more flexible, need to be more forward-thinking and looking across those long time horizons in order to think about where are the risks, what are the risks, who faces them, and what are some of the options for responding to them and preventing them and mitigating them. So there's plenty more to discuss. At WRI, we've been very involved in the lead up to COP21, and perhaps in the panel I can reflect a little bit more on how we see opportunities for addressing these issues potentially coming from Paris and playing out. Thank you very much.